will be talking chiefly about Islamic examples and contexts. I want to start with a Christian example, just to, if you like, define the territory. This is about ways of studying religious change, and particularly religious revolutions, religious crises. If you ever study the history of Christianity as a whole, really, one of the most important developments is the emergence of evangelicalism in the 18th century. You have a great movement called the Great Awakening in the United States and Western Europe. And one of the landmarks of that is a sermon preached in 1741 by a man called Jonathan Edwards called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It's a classic hellfire sermon. It tells people that basically they're miserable sinners, their existence could be snuffed out at a moment's notice. And the sermon had an absolutely astonishing effect. People were famously screaming. They were literally rolling in the aisles of the church, not in laughter, but in terror. And it just had an explosive impact. And that, in a way, set the expectations for all subsequent sermons in that movement. It created a mood. That has been studied from many different ways, history, theology, literature. But until, I think I was the first person to ask the question, what was the weather like? And it's a very interesting question. Because July 1741, the audience at that sermon had just lived through two of the coldest, most devastating winters in the previous half millennium. When we read, for example, of 10 and 20-foot snowdrifts in New England, we hear about the sea being frozen by people traveling large distances across the sea. And if you think of somebody in July of 1741 listening to something saying the end of the world is near, that we are sinners whose lives could be snapped out in an instant, this has a powerful impact. So Edwards was a great stylist, great orator. But what you have to understand is the audience, what were their expectations? And they were heavily conditioned by climate. So here's my basic argument. Through history, climate changes very frequently. Now, in saying that, I am not trying to underestimate the changes we're going through presently. These are different because in previous eras, we were talking about transient events that reversed of their own accords. The reasons for such events were diverse. I'll come to them in a moment. But some of these were particularly devastating and frightening. And in the mindset of previous eras, they could not fail to have dramatic effects. What could these effects be? In some cases, they might condition people to apocalyptic rhetoric. In other instances, they could uproot social orders and lay the foundation for the creation of new social orders, and especially new religious movements. And what I would like to do is to take a number of eras in Islamic history and show how scholars presently are looking at these as shaped by climate. Now, obviously, what you try and avoid here is any kind of materialistic explanation that you say, well, this is solely because of temperatures and rainfall and droughts and so on. But equally, you cannot ignore those factors. A preacher may preach, but whether that person is listened to is conditioned by events. And let me take one example from the foundational years of Islam. There is now a lot of literature on the era before the time of Muhammad from a climate perspective. And as we know, in the 6th century of the Common Era, there are a number of great kingdoms around in the Arabian Peninsula. You have the great states in the Near East. And these are largely crippled by a climate crisis that begins in the 530s with the eruption of two supervolcanoes, which were, as in many cases, followed by major plagues and pandemics. The link between climate crisis and pandemic is actually is very close. Climate crises change environments, they change the location of the kind of hosts, they change the distribution of plants and animals, and diseases commonly follow. From the mid-6th century, the great kingdoms of the Arabian Peninsula entered deep crisis. The kingdom of Himyar collapsed. Just this year, there's an excellent study on how that was driven by drought. So things were very difficult already. And in the early 7th century, you had this great superpower conflict between the twin empires of Rome and Persia. And there are a couple of references to that in the Quran. And a great turning point came in the mid-620s when something happened and we don't entirely know what. We believe that a colossal volcano erupted. This was sufficiently dramatic to leave major traces in biological records in the American Southwest, in the records of bristlecone pines. This was a once in a millennium event, literally. And it apparently happened in probably 625, probably a volcano. We don't exactly know where. The effects were astonishing. We know of plagues. We know of great dust clouds and ash falls around the world. Ash fell in the streets of Constantinople. The skies were blacked out across certainly the Middle East and China. Empires collapsed. The Eastern Turkic Empire collapsed. That sent large bodies of nomadic warriors across Central Asia. It's a long story. It's a book in its own right. But we know that decided effectively this war between Rome and Persia. Rome was very much the underdog, the Byzantine Empire. But the emperor managed to negotiate the extreme winter conditions that suddenly befell across the Middle East and in spring and summer. And we have an account of a battle fought between the Romans and the Persians, which is fascinating because you have to think how people fight. They fight with bows and arrows, obviously, but they also fight with these great siege engines, which fire heavy rocks or large numbers of arrows at a time. The Persian military was largely disabled because of torrential rain that fell for days, and because the skies were black. They were fighting in a fog. They were trying to fight in midnight at noon, is the phrase I would use. The Romans were better, more flexible, and they won. The Romans destroyed the Persian Empire, and that contributed to a power vacuum. What does this have to do with Islam? This is the power vacuum, of course, into which Islam will expand in the 630s. I also draw your attention to what is happening in the years 627 and 628. This is the great change in fortunes in the advance of Muhammad and his cause. You have the Battle of the Trench in 627. And it comes at a time when, first of all, if one is preaching a message of judgment, it's a very good time to do it, because if you look up, the skies are dark. It is a time of, I suppose, traumatic weather and climate conditions, which cannot fail to affect people's sense of, it is a time of judgment. It is a time of divine intervention. And that's an approach to weather, an approach to climate, which is common to all cultures right up until the 19th century in the West and later in other eras. I would suggest to you, the 620s is a very crucial era in the rise of Islam. If you want to understand it and you do not pay attention to that climate dimension, you're missing a very important part of the story. You know, if you look at these bristlecone pines, these trees in the American Southwest, you can mark the real extreme catastrophes. There's one in 43 BC, and the next one is 625 AD. You can go for several centuries without something that has this effect, and it suddenly does. So the picture that I'm showing here is of the Emperor Heraclius dispatching the Persian Emperor, and you'll notice that there is an angel in attendance supervising this act and this victory. It was very hard for people of this era not to think in terms of providence, of heavenly judgment. So what happens here? I've mentioned volcanoes. Volcanoes occur at different times and at different levels of forcefulness, if you like. They are graded from 1 to 8. Thankfully, it's 75,000 years since we had a grade 8, which almost caused the extinction of the human race. Grade 7s happen fairly every few centuries. And we know of some that are very well recorded. There's one called Tambora in 1815. And the records of that, as I said, we get black clouds, we get ash falls, we get years of catastrophe. People do not have food. And when people do not have food, they starve, but they riot, they rebel. And often an event like this is followed by great social, political upheaval. And later on, I'm going to be talking about a couple of events where we had such upheavals, possibly as a result of volcanoes. The other thing that we need to pay attention to is the energy emitted by the sun. We think of the sun as being a very stable and constant thing, and it is not. It emits more or less energy at different times. When it emits less energy, the world tends to be much cooler or much hotter at other times. And early societies measured this by what we call by the frequency of sunspots. When there weren't many sunspots, the sun was not very energetic. The earth is getting cooler. And I just draw your attention to this chart where we look at the 17th century, the years between 1650 and 1700, when sunspots basically disappeared, when the sun is not doing its job, and the world enters an extremely, extremely cold period, one of the coldest in recorded history. I will be coming back to that. You may have heard of something called the Little Ice Age, which runs for some centuries. This is the extreme part of the Little Ice Age. And the other thing I'm going to be talking about, the amount of energy the sun emits, conditions, the currents in the oceans. There is a great cycle, which is called the El Nino cycle, named from times when the eastern portions of the Pacific are extremely warm. That has climatic impacts around the world. And you may think, what does this have to do with the rest of the world? A strong El Nino can be reflected in, for instance, the levels of the River Nile. It can be reflected in droughts across the Middle East. It can affect the monsoon, which is the world's largest and most influential climate event in terms of the number of people affected. And the opposite of the El Nino is the La Nina, when it is the seas to the west that are extremely heated. And that is usually associated with a lot of volcanic eruptions. It does not matter for present purposes exactly how these systems work, but what I'm trying to say is you can look at particular eras where you have, as the phrase goes, a perfect storm of things coming together, of solar energy, of El Nino cycles, of volcanoes. And in those extreme eras, these are very bad times to be alive, and that is reflected in religion, in revolutions, and religious politics. And what I would like to do is take basically 3 eras here and how they shaped Islam. These are four well-known Christian figures. These are the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as described in the book of Revelation, and it's a good point, they do work together. When you have one of these climate catastrophes, you have famine, obviously, you have death, but you also have plague and war and revolution together, and I'll be coming back to this. I said I'd talk about three eras. One of the absolute worst begins around the year 1314. And in 1314, everything that possibly can go wrong in climate goes wrong. It is a time in Europe of soaking rain through the summers. It is a time of drought and catastrophe across the Near East. And this is the start of what would become known as the Little Ice Age in Europe. As often happens, it is followed by a pandemic, a global series of pandemics, and more important, a phrase we're not so familiar with, we've all heard these days of a pandemic, a panzootic. A pandemic means when people around the world suffer from a dreadful disease. A panzootic is when animals around the world suffer from dreadful diseases and die. And that is very bad because it means that it destroys the livelihood of people who cultivate cattle and sheep and goats. And what do they do at that point? They starve, they march on the cities, they rebel, and very often what they do is they look for scapegoats. And the years around 1320, wherever you are in the world, are a great era for scapegoating. Christians not only persecute Jews, but they form new dreadful conspiracy theories about what Jews do. Jews poison wells and spread these awful diseases. Christians persecute witches and heretics, and in fact, they formulate elaborate new theories about who these witches and heretics are. The exact same thing happens in the Islamic world, in a sense, in reverse, with Christians not as the perpetrators, but as the targets of conspiracy theory. If you want to think of the Christian world at this time, think of these people, the flagellants, the people who try and appease God's wrath by marching across the countryside, whipping themselves to try and earn God's favor. But more dramatically, you find the people who have behaved so badly as to stir God's wrath, and this means heretics. I mentioned the years around 1320. Let's think of this in terms of the history of the Middle East. In Egypt, 1321 is famous as one of the grim and bitter years. Up until this point, the conversion to Islam has been proceeding at a fairly steady rate with minimal examples of forced conversion, but there's still a very large Coptic Christian minority, which possibly by this point is not even that much of a minority. Things change very dramatically in the year 1321. People are under terrible pressure and strain from climate, from economic ruin, from disease, and they have to find the ones who are to blame. Muslims target Christians just as Christians targeted Jews. Christian churches and monasteries are destroyed in large numbers. There are calls for the mass killing of Christians, which the Sultan of the time tries very hard to combat, but he's dealing with crowds of tens of thousands of angry people. And he does something which is interesting, which is he seizes some leading suspects and through torture produces a series of conspiracy stories that sound remarkably modern. What Christians are planning to do is to ally with the Byzantine Empire to use weapons of mass destruction, and especially their Greek fire weapon, a kind of napalm, to destroy sacred Islamic sites. It is if you like, a vast terrorist conspiracy. Wherever you look around the Middle East at this time, you see somewhat similar patterns, perhaps not quite as acute as what we see in Egypt, but very much in the same model. In Mesopotamia, for example, the Church of the East has maintained a very strong existence, a strong institutional existence, and it's very clearly based in Baghdad, which is a great Islamic city. It's in the early 1320s, around 1321, 1322, as people are starving, as the diseases are spreading, that the crowds turn against the Christians. And this is the point at which the church authorities flee to what we would now call northern Iraq. It's a time when Jews flee Christian Europe to Eastern Europe, when Christians flee the Muslim cities where they can no longer sustain their existence. If you ever read Ibn Battuta talking about these years, there are so many references to, I visit this city, and once upon a time, the walls enclosed this vast area, but now it's just a quarter of that. We read about nomadic populations taking over formerly arable, irrigated land. It is a time of very rapid ecological change. Of course, it has something to do with the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, but it is also a precise echo of this little ice age. I would also suggest, and I'm sure I'm talking to people there who know vastly more about this than I do, that this is a time when very hardline theories, very rigorous theories of religion acquire greater plausibility and a larger audience. I mean, the person who is living through this and writing through these dreadful years is Ibn Taymiyyah in the 1310s. And he is living in a world of, well, if you want to argue the world is under judgment for its bad ways, then you can certainly make a very plausible case. So like I say, the 1320s are one great era. And I can, as they say, go on indefinitely about the number of conspiracy theories that arise in 1320, 1321, that very, very focused era. Oh, in Christian Europe, for example, not only are there theories about how Jews are spreading disease, they're also doing it on behalf of Muslim authorities in Spain. Mutual conspiracies flourish. I'll move on to one other era. I mentioned things become very difficult in the end of the 16th century into the 17th century. This is when the Little Ice Age moves to what we call the Hyper Little Ice Age, which is a clumsy term. Why this is happening, there's a lot of debate. We know there's a huge amount of volcanic activity between about 1560 onwards. And in the 1590s and 1600s, things become very dark indeed. And I don't just mean that as a metaphor. There are huge volcanoes that erupt. They result in famine and plague. In the opening years of the 17th century, for example, Russia loses probably a couple of million dead as a result of famine. One of the states that is hardest hit by this is the Ottoman Empire. And I particularly mention this because this is the subject of one of the best books that specifically interprets political change from a climate perspective. And this is by Sam White, who wrote a book called The Climate of Rebellion in the Early Modern Ottoman Empire. And I draw that phrase to your attention, the climate of rebellion. Rebellions generally do not just happen through the whim of one man. If one lord says, let's go rebel against the king or the sultan, then very few people will pay attention to him because the states tend to be very vindictive and very violent in suppressing revolt. But what happens if you get something resembling social and economic failure? The 1590s have been described as, it's a misleadingly funny phrase, which is the nasty 90s. Things are going wrong everywhere. It is an era of terrible droughts in some areas, of soaking rains through the growing season in others. In the early 17th century, we moved to a time of unbelievable cold, and it's usually measured by the waters of Constantinople freezing hard enough to walk across. And you think how this affects Anatolia, which is the heart of the Ottoman Empire. And in the 1590s, society is approaching dissolution. It's a time when livestock is dying out, when crops are failing, when people are thinking of moving en masse to the cities to try and put together some kind of living. And in 1594, you get the beginning of what's called the Chilali rebellions, which are the deadliest internal threat that the Ottoman Empire had faced hitherto, and would face for a good long time afterwards. It's a time when local lords, local warlords are seizing authority, and it wouldn't be until about 1610 or so until the Ottomans restore power over this heartland. And as I say, that's often described as a turning point after a couple of centuries of steady ascent and growth and consolidation. And what wrecks them is what has been described, as I say, as a climate of rebellion. It's an extremely bloody time. I'm anxious not to hop around too much here, but I just want to look at one other era to see how, if you like, a climate of rebellion emerges and has an absolutely transformative effect on a great Islamic power. From about the year 1675, the world enters this extremely cold period. It's the time when the sun has given up emitting warmth. It's a very low solar energy. It's a time of many volcanoes. And we read the effects around the world. 1675 is a time of catastrophe. In Cairo, for example, the great fashion item through much of the year is warm furs to keep you warm in the dreadful cold. In London, which this picture shows, you have 10-foot deep ice on the Thames. And when people actually build whole cities on the Thames as for circuses and shops and parades and so on, it's a time of extreme and unbelievable cold. And that in many ways is, is fun and pleasurable. But it also means growing seasons are dramatically shorter. 1679 is one of the worst years for disease and early death and early mortality in Britain and in France. Famines rage through the following decade. And if you think of being an ordinary subject of a king or a lord, and you are starving, your fear of being killed in a rebellion gives way to a more basic fear, which is, how are we going to find food? It is a great time of rebellions, and one of these is going to be an extraordinarily influential event. This map shows the growth of the Ottoman Empire, and you'll see that by the 1680s, they have control basically the southeastern quadrant of Europe. They control most of Hungary, and Christian Hungary is left. And in 1678-79, it begins a large national revolt against the Habsburg Christian rulers. That is not an ideological revolt, it is a survival revolt. People are starving, they fear immediate death, they need food, and so they seek to overthrow the religious order. That leads to a great war. This is led by a man called Imre Thököly, who is a faithful Christian. But the Christians soon start to think of turning for assistance to the Ottoman Turks. And this is the background to one of the most famous, most influential wars of the era. This then leads the Ottomans to try and march into the remainder of Hungary to link up with these Christian rebels. And this leads to this great event of the Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1683, which most people would regard as one of the turning points in European history. This is the Sultan of the time, Mehmed IV. And it's not an absurd scheme as it stands. There are probably 150,000 soldiers. They are then defeated at Vienna. The story is often told. But most accounts of the story that we read certainly in British history, tend to end it there. What they neglect is that this begins what's called the Great Turkish War, which lasts till 1699, when the Ottomans suffer repeated catastrophic blows. And at every point, those catastrophic blows cannot be understood without the climate context. It is very hard to exaggerate just how bad things become for the Ottomans over those 16 years. Once again, the Golden Horn is frozen solid. Crops and herds are dying out. If you are in Anatolia or if you are in southeastern Europe, you are basically living in ice age conditions. So the Christians win this great victory in 1683, but they then push on. And the years between 1685 and 87 are very remarkable. This is the era of one of the most intense El Niños ever recorded, which has its impact around the world. And it is a time when, by 1687, the Ottoman Empire is approaching a stage that we today would know in terms of state failure. The Christians win a great battle at what's called Second Mohacs in 1687. But by this point, the Ottoman army has come close to dissolution. Most of the army has fled, including the elite imperial units, the Janissaries and the Sipahis, who have fled back to Constantinople. The Christians managed to take large territories. By the late 1690s, they're pushing down to Belgrade. And at every case, they're going through this great frozen landscape. The new Sultan is Suleiman II, who manages to save things. Mehmed has, of course, been deposed. But the sheer degree of collapse among the Ottomans in 1687 is very remarkable. Nobody's paying taxes. Nobody, the state has no income. Each military unit is looking out for its own interest. It's a time when they're struggling for survival. And the Christian armies are more used to this kind of weather. It's as if you like, the Arctic suddenly moved south, and the Ottomans suddenly found themselves in those conditions. The next time when things become that bad is in 1699, which is the year that the Christians are pushing into Belgrade and Serbia. And that's the year when the Ottomans are forced to make peace. You cannot write the history of the Ottomans in this era without that climate dimension. I know I keep saying things, but I do repeat it. Obviously, the Ottomans continue into the 18th century as a powerful state, but this has set up a great period of expectation and for the Christians, and their sense is it's a matter of time before we again can push into the into Southeastern Europe. So I've tried to establish a point here, which is that you get these climate episodes, they can be devastating. Now, before you start thinking that I'm only talking about disasters, I'm certainly not. There are times when the sun shines, the skies are blue, the seas are warm. You can expand settlement when people are happy to pay taxes and when governments become very rich and they express their gratitude to God by building appropriate religious buildings. For example, if you look at the great age of medieval Spain in the 10th century, 10th and 11th century, symbolized by something like the great Mosque of Cordoba, it is a time of great warmth, great success based on climate in that way. In later eras, however, we are talking about the opposite kind of impact. Scapegoating, state collapse, and so on. So with that as a background, let me turn to the modern world. As I always say, I am a professor, not a prophet, but I think you can make some reasonable predictions. In earlier eras, we're talking about transient episodes. The El Nino of 1685 to 7 came and went away. Things got better in the 18th century. That's fine. We are now entering a phase where global climate change and global warming becomes established. It becomes part of the world in which we expect. We're talking about rising temperatures. We can debate exactly where this is coming from. Certainly, the great Western powers had their impact on doing this in years gone by. More recently, it's China and India. But whatever the story, we're talking about a forthcoming, much more, a world of greater warmth. And the areas that it will affect will particularly be those within the tropics. You know, the tropics is not a phrase that we often use in political analysis. We should. I think in 20 years' time, when a political crisis erupts around the world, the first question is going to be, what is its latitude? Because that will decide its vulnerability to extreme climate change. If you are looking at this from a point of view of Islam, then the first thing you notice is some of the areas that are most dramatically affected by climate change include the world's largest Islamic nation, which is, pardon me, which is Indonesia. Indonesia, by the way, is presently in the middle of moving its capital of Jakarta to a new location less vulnerable to rising seas. You see other very, very populous nations such as Bangladesh, which are under extreme threat of climate change. And more particularly, perhaps, we see the boundaries between regions, between those under extreme stress and less extreme stress, particularly along the world's 10th parallel of latitude, which often coincide with Islamic Christian frontiers, and where, based on past precedent, we might expect more conflict, more scapegoating, and more willingness to support extreme and militant movements. I think this is a very interesting map in its own right. This doesn't just look at areas of warmth, but areas that are most vulnerable to desertification. There are two words we'll be hearing about in the near future. With global warming, first of all, you get drying, which is called aridization, and then desertification. And if you look at that 10th parallel in Africa, you look at basically the whole of the Levant and Iran and into Central Asia, and you look at those very, very populous areas, areas with very significant Islamic populations, and you look at areas that stand the threat of ruin from desertification. I think this map should be required viewing for policymakers. It has been, I've suggested that based on past precedent, we might expect political conflict and violence to result from dramatic climate change. We don't have to look into the future. There are very good analyses of changes in the Middle East over the past 20 years, and particularly the long drought, particularly in Syria, from the start of this century, one of the most severe droughts since the era of the First Crusade. And you think, how does a severe drought like this affect the country? Well, it destroys agriculture. It forces marginal people to abandon the land. They go to the cities where they have to be taken care of, where they put a lot of stress on the economic facilities of those cities. They go to Damascus, they go to Aleppo. And there's a lively theory that says that, I'm going to use this phrase again, you can't really understand the Syrian civil war that erupts in 2011 without looking at this background of drought and climate-driven crisis. I won't take this at great length, but I also point out that the areas in Turkey which are severely affected include the areas which were the most avid supporters in early years of Mr. Erdogan's party, but they were under a huge amount of economic stress. I can talk about this in many ways, but let me just say there are a couple of areas of unique stress around the world that I pay a lot of attention to. One is what's called the Great Lakes of Africa, enormously populous areas, very mixed Christian and Muslim populations with a considerable record of tension, depending on lakes that are some of the most endangered phenomena in the world's ecology, which are already suffering dramatically and which will become much worse and much drier by mid-century. What will the consequences for this be? Clearly, I am not optimistic. I would suggest conflict. I would suggest scapegoating. I would suggest major refugee crises. I would suggest the possibility of state failure, as has become quite widespread across the Horn of Africa. And the other area which I have written about a great deal is the Western Sahel, an area of an interesting combination. The fastest growing population in the world in terms of the highest fertility rate, the areas of the world that have done least to contribute to the climate crisis by way of economic activity, and the ones that are going to be most directly affected in terms of temperature rises, which by some projections could be 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, bringing the temperatures to areas that are not humanly sustainable. If I was looking for areas of tension and conflict and scapegoating and interreligious violence and state failure, these are the areas I would look at. Oh, incidentally, these are also the areas of fastest urbanization on the continent. Areas like Ouagadougou quite plausibly could have 8 or 11 million people by mid-century. Intriguing. If economies collapse, what do people do? Well, they don't sit there and starve to death. They move. They migrate. And this is a map of some of the main major migration routes into Europe. There is an old advertising slogan about what happens in Vegas does not stay in Vegas. What happens in the Western Sahel does not stay in the Western Sahel. It pushes into Europe. It pushes across this extremely dangerous migrant frontier of the Mediterranean, where literally thousands of people die each year, Muslims and Christians alike. And we think through the consequences of a migration like this in terms of the religious coloring of European nations, in terms of the growth of Islamic populations and of African Christian populations. So we talk about a quite revolutionary series of changes. There are many other things I can talk about here. Clearly, I have a fairly limited time. But I would look at migration. As I say, I would look at state failure. And this is something we can talk about. In earlier eras, climate crises always led to mass charges against witchcraft. This is very much a feature in large sections of Africa today, where witch trials and witch persecutions over the last 40 years have probably been as frequent, arguably more frequent, than in pretty much any other historical epoch anywhere, certainly in Europe. So, like I say, I am a professor and not a prophet, but I would turn to the words of a man called the Marquis of Halifax, who was writing in the 1680s, in his very wise words. The best way to suppose what may come is to remember what is past. The best qualification of a prophet is to have a good memory. Experience makes more prophets than revelation. I'm not going to dispute the theology of that, but I think that is a good historical statement. If you want to know the future, look at the past. And my final comment is, as we look at the history of any region, certainly the history of Islamic nations, Islamic societies, Islamic movements, then we have to pay attention to this climate context. It is not a simple materialist, one for one, this happened, therefore that happened, but very often this is what is happening in the background, and it greatly repays us to know about it. And I think that I am about at my time limit. So at that point, I will cease and say thank you so much for your hospitality.